Rebecca Stone adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses for the third time in 10 minutes, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged lesson plans on her desk. At 28, she possessed the kind of quiet presence that made administrators overlook her during faculty meetings, and students underestimate her authority in the classroom. Standing barely 5'2" with auburn hair perpetually pulled back in a modest bun, she had perfected the art of professional invisibility. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her cardigan sweaters and conservative blouses suggested nothing more threatening than a bookish educator trying to inspire reluctant teenagers to appreciate American literature. The small scar above her left eyebrow, usually hidden behind carefully styled bangs, was the only visible hint that Rebecca Stone's life hadn't always been confined to classroom walls and faculty lounges. What nobody at Lincoln Valley High School knew was that Staff Sergeant Rebecca Stone had spent 6 years serving 3 combat tours in Afghanistan with the 82nd Airborne Division. She had earned her teaching credentials through military education programs during her final deployment, dreaming of a peaceful transition from battlefields to blackboards. The nightmares that still woke her at 3 a.m., the way she instinctively mapped exit routes in every room, and the muscle memory that made her reach for weapons that were no longer there. These were secrets she kept buried beneath lesson plans and parent-teacher conferences. Her father's sudden heart attack had brought her home to rural Montana 2 years early, trading her sergeant's stripes for a substitute teacher's badge. Lincoln Valley had been desperate enough for qualified educators that they'd hired her mid-semester, grateful to find someone willing to take on the school's most challenging classes. Rebecca had made peace with starting over in a profession where her military experience was more liability than asset, where mentioning her combat background would only create uncomfortable questions and unwanted attention. She kept her head down, graded papers with mechanical precision, and counted the quiet victories. A struggling student who finally grasped symbolism in The Great Gatsby, a shy teenager who found her voice through creative writing assignments. The salary was a fraction of her military pay, but the chaos was manageable, predictable. Or so she had believed. The trouble began during her second month when she was assigned lunch duty supervision. Lincoln Valley's cafeteria operated under an unspoken hierarchy more rigid than any military chain of command, with unwritten rules that governed everything from seating arrangements to social interactions. Rebecca had been warned about the difficult students, but nobody had prepared her for Tyler Garrison. At 17, Tyler possessed the kind of natural charisma that made teachers reluctant to discipline him despite his obvious disregard for authority. Standing 6'2" with the build of someone who spent serious time in the weight room, he moved through the school's corridors with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. His perfectly tousled blonde hair and expensive athletic wear marked him as Lincoln Valley royalty, the star quarterback whose family owned half the businesses in town. Tyler's court consisted of Marcus Chen, whose family's restaurant provided him entry into the popular crowd despite his naturally introverted personality, and Jake Morrison, a linebacker whose size compensated for his lack of Tyler's natural leadership abilities. Together, they formed Lincoln Valley's unofficial ruling council, determining social standing through a complex system of approval and ostracism that had evolved over 4 years of high school politics. The incident that would define Rebecca's relationship with Tyler's group happened on a Tuesday in late October. She was monitoring the lunch period when she noticed them surrounding Emma Patterson, a sophomore whose thick glasses and second-hand clothes made her an easy target. Emma sat alone at a corner table, trying to eat her lunch while Tyler's crew loomed over her like predators circling wounded prey. "Hey, Patterson," Tyler announced loud enough for surrounding tables to hear. "My mom's been looking for someone to clean our house. Are you interested? You already dress like you work for minimum wage." The suggestion drew cruel laughter from his followers and nervous giggles from students grateful not to be in Emma's position. Rebecca felt the familiar surge of protective instinct that had served her well in combat situations, but she forced herself to approach with the measured calm of an educator rather than the aggressive intervention of a soldier. "Mr. Garrison," she said, her voice carrying just enough authority to cut through the cafeteria noise, "please return to your assigned table." Tyler turned to face her with the kind of slow, deliberate movement designed to demonstrate his lack of concern for her authority. His smile was perfectly polite, the kind that gave him plausible deniability with administrators while making his contempt crystal clear to everyone else. "Of course, Miss Stone," he replied, emphasizing her title with just enough sarcasm to be insulting without being overtly disrespectful. "We were just having a friendly conversation with Emma here. Nothing wrong with being social, right?" Rebecca recognized the calculated nature of his response, technically compliant while maintaining his dominant position in the interaction. She had encountered similar tactics from insurgents who understood how to exploit rules of engagement, using apparent cooperation to mask continued aggression. "The conversation is over," she said firmly. "Please give Emma space to finish her lunch in peace." Tyler's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, his polite mask slipping just enough to reveal the cold calculation beneath. He was clearly unused to being contradicted by adults, particularly by someone he perceived as weak and ineffective. Most teachers at Lincoln Valley had learned to choose their battles carefully when dealing with Tyler Garrison, understanding that his family's influence could make their professional lives considerably more difficult. "Sure thing, Miss Stone," he said, but his tone carried a promise of future consequences. "We wouldn't want anyone to feel uncomfortable at our cafeteria." As Tyler and his friends retreated to their usual table, Rebecca helped Emma gather her scattered belongings. The girl was shaking slightly, whether from relief or residual fear, Rebecca couldn't tell. "Thank you," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible above the cafeteria noise. "They've been doing this every day since school started." Rebecca felt her jaw clench involuntarily, muscle memory from countless briefings, where superior officers had described rules of engagement that often seemed designed to protect the wrong people. "Has anyone reported this behavior to the administration?" Emma's laugh was bitter beyond her 15 years. "Tyler's dad sponsors half the school's athletic programs. His mom runs the PTA. Nobody's going to do anything that might upset the Garrison family." The political reality of small-town education hit Rebecca like incoming artillery fire. She had left one battlefield only to discover another, where the rules of engagement were just as complex and the consequences of missteps could be just as devastating to the people she was supposed to protect. Over the following weeks, Rebecca began to understand the intricate power structure that governed Lincoln Valley High School. Tyler's influence extended far beyond the cafeteria, reaching into classroom dynamics and social hierarchies that most teachers either didn't recognize or chose to ignore. He had mastered the art of plausible deniability, crafting his harassment campaigns to stay just below the threshold that would trigger serious administrative intervention. During her American literature classes, Tyler would ask seemingly innocent questions designed to waste time and derail lesson plans. "Ms. Stone, I'm confused about this Hemingway guy. Didn't he just write about drinking and fighting? Kind of like some people we know who might have military backgrounds?" The comment was subtle enough that other students might miss the reference, but Rebecca understood she was being probed, tested for weaknesses. Tyler was gathering intelligence about her background, looking for pressure points he could exploit. In the hallways between classes, his group would position themselves to force other students to navigate around them, creating deliberate bottlenecks that allowed them to control traffic flow while maintaining the appearance of casual socializing. Rebecca noticed how certain students would take longer routes to avoid these checkpoints, adding unnecessary stress to their already complicated teenage lives. The psychological warfare was expertly crafted, designed to establish dominance through 1,000 small humiliations that were individually too minor to warrant punishment, but collectively created an atmosphere of intimidation that affected the entire school community. Rebecca recognized the tactics because she had seen them employed by enemy combatants who understood that controlling civilian populations required subtlety rather than overt violence. During third period English, Tyler would accidentally knock books off desks while walking past struggling students, creating disruptions that interrupted the learning environment while appearing accidental to casual observers. In study hall, he would claim tables near the windows, then position his group to block natural light from reaching students he wanted to isolate. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon, early November. Rebecca had stayed late to grade essays, working in her classroom while most of the building emptied out for the weekend. The hallways were mostly quiet, except for the distant sounds of basketball practice and the custodial staff beginning their evening routines. She was walking toward the main office to make copies when she heard voices echoing from around the corner. Tyler's voice, unmistakably confident, mixed with what sounded like pleading from someone much younger. "Please, I already gave you my lunch money yesterday," a voice was saying, high-pitched with desperation. "I don't have anything else." Rebecca recognized the voice as belonging to David Kim, a seventh grader who had been transferred to the high school for advanced mathematics courses. At 12 years old, he was intellectually capable of handling high school coursework, but emotionally and physically unprepared for the social complexities of teenage hierarchy. "See, that's where you're wrong, Kim," Tyler replied, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting his way. "You've got something we need, and we're going to teach you how to share it properly." Rebecca moved closer, staying in the shadows while she assessed the situation. Military training had taught her the importance of gathering intelligence before committing to action, understanding the full scope of a threat before determining the appropriate response. Tyler stood with Marcus and Jake, forming a triangle around David that blocked his escape routes while maintaining the appearance of casual conversation. David clutched his backpack against his chest like a shield, his face pale with the kind of fear that Rebecca had seen on civilian faces in combat zones. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "What we need," Tyler continued, "is for you to understand your place in the ecosystem. Here, smart kids like you provide services to important kids like us. It's just natural selection." The casual cruelty in his voice triggered something deep in Rebecca's military training, the protective instinct that had made her volunteer for convoy security duty, putting herself between enemy fire and the people she was sworn to protect. But she held her position, continuing to gather information while her mind automatically calculated angles of approach, potential weapons in the environment, and the most efficient methods for neutralizing multiple opponents without causing permanent damage. This was her school, her responsibility, and these were her students. The quiet teacher who had spent months avoiding confrontation was about to discover that some battles couldn't be walked away from, no matter how much she wanted to maintain her carefully constructed peaceful existence. Rebecca stepped forward. From the shadows, her movement deliberate and controlled. The soft squeak of her sensible shoes against the polished linoleum announced her presence before her voice did. "Gentlemen," she said, her tone carrying the kind of calm authority that made all four boys turn toward her. "I believe you have somewhere else you need to be." Tyler's expression shifted through a rapid sequence of emotions: surprise, calculation, and then that familiar predatory smile that had intimidated countless students and faculty members over the years. He straightened to his full height, using his physical advantage to project dominance. "Ms. Stone," he said with exaggerated politeness, "we were just helping David here with some academic guidance. You know how challenging the transition can be for younger students." Rebecca's eyes swept the scene with tactical precision, noting the positioning of each participant, the blocked escape routes, and David's obvious distress. The boy's breathing was shallow and rapid, his knuckles white where he gripped his backpack. Straps, classic signs of the stress response in a non-combatant under threat. "I'm sure David appreciates your concern," Rebecca replied evenly. However, academic guidance typically takes place during scheduled tutoring sessions, not in empty hallways after school hours. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing that they had been caught in a situation that couldn't be easily explained away. His family's restaurant depended on community goodwill, and he understood the potential consequences of being associated with obvious bullying behavior. Jake, however, seemed oblivious to the subtext. "We're just talking, Miss Stone. Nothing wrong with upperclassmen being friendly to the new kids, right?" The question was clearly intended to put Rebecca in an impossible position. Any attempt to separate the students would appear to be discouraging positive social interaction, while walking away would abandon David to whatever Tyler had planned for him. Rebecca had encountered similar psychological traps during her military service, situations where enemy combatants would use human shields or exploit rules of engagement to continue their operations while appearing to comply with international law. The solution was always the same: focus on the objective rather than the justification. "David," she said, addressing the 7th grader directly, "don't you have math? Tutoring with Mrs. Patterson in 10 minutes? David's eyes widened with understanding. Mrs. Patterson was the school's remedial math teacher, and there was no way a student advanced enough for high school mathematics would need her services. But the fictional appointment gave him a legitimate reason to leave without appearing to flee from Tyler's group. "Yes, ma'am," David said quickly, his voice cracking slightly with relief. "I should probably head there now." He moved toward Rebecca with the kind of desperate urgency that confirmed her assessment of the situation. Tyler started to step into his path, but Rebecca's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Mr. Garrison." The single word carried enough authority to freeze Tyler in place. Something in Rebecca's tone triggered an instinctive response that bypassed his conscious thoughts, the kind of command presence that had been drilled into her through years of military training. For a moment, the confident bully found himself responding to someone he had dismissed as weak and ineffective. David slipped past Tyler's group and hurried down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. Rebecca waited until he had disappeared around the corner before addressing Tyler's crew again. "Gentlemen, I believe you were leaving as well." Tyler's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Being commanded by someone he considered beneath him was a new experience, and his reaction suggested that he didn't handle challenges to his authority well. The polite mask he wore around adults was beginning to slip, revealing the entitled teenager beneath. "You know what, Miss Stone?" Tyler said, his voice losing its carefully maintained respectful tone. "I think you're overstepping your boundaries here. We weren't doing anything wrong, and you're treating us like criminals." Rebecca recognized the deflection tactic, shifting from defense to offense, making the authority figure justify their intervention rather than addressing the original problematic behavior. She had seen insurgents use similar strategies during interrogations, trying to control the narrative by changing the subject. "My boundary is the safety and well-being of all students in this building," Rebecca replied. "When I see a 7th grader cornered by 3 upperclassmen in an empty hallway, that boundary has been crossed." Marcus tugged at Tyler's sleeve, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating confrontation. "Come on, man, let's just go. Coach wants us in the weight room anyway." But Tyler was no longer thinking strategically. The public challenge to his authority had triggered something primal, the kind of wounded pride that made people do stupid things. He took a step closer to Rebecca, using his height advantage to loom over her. "You don't know what you're dealing with here, lady," he said, dropping all pretense of respect. "This isn't some military base where you can bark orders at people." This is my school, in my town, and you're just some washed-up soldier playing. Teacher, the comment hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Rebecca felt her pulse steady rather than quicken, the familiar calm that preceded combat settling over her like a well-worn jacket. Tyler had just revealed that he had been researching her background, gathering intelligence for exactly this. Kind of confrontation. Interesting, Rebecca said quietly. Tell me, Mr. Garrison, what else do you think you know about my background? The question seemed to catch Tyler off guard. He had expected anger, defensiveness, or intimidation from his revelation. Instead, Rebecca's tone suggested genuine curiosity, as if she were conducting a classroom discussion rather than facing a personal attack. I know you couldn't hack it in the real military, Tyler continued, gaining confidence from what he interpreted as her passive response. Otherwise you wouldn't be stuck here teaching brats like us for 30 grand a year. Jake laughed nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, but unwilling to abandon his friend. Marcus had gone pale, understanding that they were crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Rebecca nodded thoughtfully, as if Tyler had made a particularly insightful observation. You're partially correct. I did leave the military earlier than originally planned. Family circumstances required my return to civilian life. Her calm acknowledgement seemed to deflate some of Tyler's aggression. He had been prepared for denial or anger, not reasoned discussion of his accusations. However, Rebecca continued, your research appears to have some significant gaps. Tell me, what unit was I assigned to during my final deployment? Tyler's confident expression began to waver. He had clearly gathered surface-level information about her military service, but not the kind of detailed intelligence that would reveal the true nature of her experience. Does it matter? He said, trying to regain control of the conversation. Military is military. You follow orders, you march around, you pretend to be tough. Not exactly rocket science. Rebecca's smile was gentle, almost maternal. You're right. That it's not rocket science. It's considerably more complex than that. But I can see you've reached the limits of your knowledge on the subject. She turned to leave, then paused as if remembering something important. Oh, and Mr. Garrison? If I ever see you cornering another student, the way you cornered David today, we're going to have a much longer conversation about boundaries and consequences. I trust you understand my meaning. The casual nature of her threat made it somehow more ominous than if she had shouted or made dramatic gestures. Tyler found himself nodding automatically before catching himself, angry at being manipulated into compliance. This isn't over, he said, falling back on the standard bully threat when other tactics failed. No, Rebecca agreed pleasantly. I don't imagine it is. Over the following weeks, the dynamic between Rebecca and Tyler's group shifted into something resembling a Cold War. Tyler was too smart to launch direct attacks that could be easily documented and reported, but his campaign of psychological harassment became more sophisticated and targeted. During Rebecca's classes, he would ask seemingly innocent questions designed to expose her military background to other students. Miss Stone, when Hemingway writes about war, do you think he's being realistic? I mean, you would know better than most of us, right? The questions were crafted to put her in impossible positions, acknowledging her military experience would invite unwanted attention and potentially traumatize students who had their own complicated relationships with American military involvement overseas. Deflecting the questions made her appear evasive and unprofessional. Tyler also began targeting students who sought Rebecca's help or protection. Emma Patterson found her locker vandalized with crude drawings that stopped just short of violating school policies. David Kim discovered his advanced mathematics homework missing from his backpack on multiple occasions, forcing him to repeat assignments and struggle to keep up with his accelerated coursework. The attacks were carefully orchestrated to avoid direct evidence of Tyler's involvement. while making it clear that association with Rebecca carried consequences. Other faculty members began to distance themselves from her, unwilling to risk becoming collateral damage in what they saw as an unnecessary conflict with one of the school's most influential families. Principal Margaret Williams called Rebecca to her office on a Wednesday afternoon in late November. Williams was a career educator in her late 50s who had learned to navigate small-town politics with the skill of a diplomat. Her office walls were covered with photographs from decades of graduation ceremonies and school events, testament to her deep roots in the Lincoln Valley community. "Rebecca," she began, using her first name in a way that suggested this would be a conversation between colleagues rather than supervisor and subordinate. "I've been hearing some concerning reports about tensions between you and some of our students." Rebecca had been expecting this conversation since her first confrontation with Tyler. She settled into the chair across from Williams' desk, maintaining the respectful posture she had learned during countless military briefings. "What kind of reports?" Rebecca asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Williams consulted a file on her desk, her expression carefully neutral. "Multiple instances of what could be interpreted as confrontational behavior toward students. Questions about your teaching methods and classroom management techniques. Concerns from parents about your background and its appropriateness for an educational environment." The last point confirmed Rebecca's suspicions about the source of the complaints. Tyler had clearly escalated beyond school-based harassment to involving his family's social network in pressuring the administration. "Have any specific violations of school policy been identified?" Rebecca asked. "Not exactly," Williams admitted. "But Rebecca, you have to understand the delicate balance we maintain here. The Garrison family has been part of this community for 3 generations. Tom Garrison sits on the school board, and his wife coordinates most of our fundraising efforts. We can't afford to alienate families like that over what might be personality conflicts." Rebecca recognized the political reality behind Williams' carefully diplomatic language. She was being told to back down, to accept Tyler's behavior as the cost of maintaining institutional stability. "What about the students Tyler has been targeting?" Rebecca asked. "Emma Patterson, David Kim, others who don't have wealthy parents or family connections. What's our responsibility to them?" Williams shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "We have anti-bullying policies in place, and we investigate all legitimate complaints. But Rebecca, teenagers sometimes exaggerate situations, and we have to be careful not to overreact to normal social dynamics." The phrase "normal social dynamics" struck Rebecca like a physical blow. She had seen similar rationalizations used to justify abandoning local populations to enemy control when military operations became politically inconvenient. "So the students who need protection must get at least, because their families don't have political influence," Rebecca said, not bothering to disguise her disappointment. "It's not that simple," Williams replied, but her tone suggested she knew exactly how simple it was. "We have to consider the greater good of the school community. Sometimes that means making difficult choices about which battles to fight." Rebecca understood that she was being given an ultimatum disguised as career advice. Play by the rules. That protected the powerful, or find herself looking for another job in a profession where blacklisting was common and effective. She left Williams' office with a clear understanding of her position in Lincoln Valley's social hierarchy. She was expendable in ways that Tyler never would be, and any attempt to protect vulnerable students would ultimately cost her the ability to help them at all. That evening, Rebecca sat in her small apartment grading papers and contemplating her limited options. She had left the military hoping to find a battlefield where the rules of engagement were clearer and the enemy was easier to identify. Instead, she had discovered that civilian life presented its own complex moral challenges. Situations where doing the right thing often conflicted with institutional survival. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Military teachers don't last long here." Ask around about what happened to the last one who caused problems." Rebecca stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. But the implied threat was clear. Tyler's campaign was escalating beyond school grounds into direct intimidation. He was apparently confident enough in his family's protection to make explicit threats about her employment security. She opened her laptop and began researching her predecessor, the military veteran who had apparently taught at Lincoln Valley before her arrival. What she discovered in the archived local newspaper articles and school board meeting minutes painted a disturbing picture of systematic intimidation and institutional failure. Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell, retired Army Rangers with 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart, had lasted exactly 18 months at Lincoln Valley High School. His military record was exemplary: decorated combat veteran, expert in counterinsurgency operations, specialist in training local forces to defend civilian populations. But none of that experience had prepared him for the political warfare of small-town education. Mitchell's downfall had begun when he attempted to protect a student named Sarah Chen, Marcus's older sister, from harassment by Cameron Garrison, Tyler's brother, who had graduated 3 years earlier. Cameron had been the golden boy of his generation, quarterback, valedictorian, early admission to Stanford University. He had also been a sophisticated predator who used his academic achievements and family connections to systematically abuse younger students. The newspaper articles painted Cameron's harassment campaign against Sarah as teenage romance gone wrong and misunderstandings between young people learning to navigate relationships. But Rebecca's military training helped her read between the lines of carefully sanitized reporting. The pattern described was textbook psychological warfare designed to isolate and break down a target's resistance. Sarah had been forced to change her class schedule multiple times to avoid Cameron. Her academic performance had plummeted as she struggled to concentrate while constantly watching for threats. Friends had distanced themselves to avoid becoming collateral damage in Cameron's campaign of intimidation. The classic signs of a victim under sustained psychological attack. Mitchell had documented everything with military precision: incident reports, witness statements, photographic evidence of vandalized property, and threatening messages. He had followed every official protocol, filed every required form, presented his evidence to administrators with the kind of organized professionalism that had served him well in briefing senior officers about enemy activities. But Cameron Garrison wasn't an enemy combatant in a foreign theater of operations. He was the son of the school board president and the nephew of the town's largest employer. His family had donated the money for the school's new computer lab and sponsored the football team's equipment for the past decade. He was untouchable in ways that transcended evidence or official policy. The breaking point had come during homecoming week, when Cameron had cornered Sarah in an empty chemistry lab after school. According to witness statements that Rebecca found buried in police reports, Cameron had attempted to force himself on Sarah, using his size and strength to pin her against a lab bench while she screamed for help. Mitchell had heard the screams from the hallway and responded with the kind of immediate tactical action that had saved lives in Afghanistan. He had kicked down the locked door, assessed the threat in milliseconds, and neutralized Cameron with the minimum force necessary to stop the assault. Cameron's dislocated shoulder was the result of a standard restraint technique designed to immobilize without causing permanent damage, but by the time police arrived, the narrative had already been crafted. Cameron claimed that he and Sarah had been studying together when Mitchell burst in without warning and attacked him for no reason. Sarah, traumatized and terrified of further retaliation, had been too frightened to contradict Cameron's version of events. Mitchell found himself arrested for assault on a minor and suspended from his teaching position pending investigation. The charges were eventually dropped when Sarah finally found the courage to tell the truth, but Mitchell's reputation was already destroyed. Parents demanded his removal. citing concerns about violent tendencies and inappropriate responses to normal teenage situations. The school board, led by Cameron's father, voted unanimously to accept Mitchell's resignation and implement new policies about de-escalation techniques. In student conflicts, Mitchell had disappeared from Lincoln Valley within a week of his resignation. Rebecca's research suggested he had left Montana entirely, unable to find employment and education anywhere in the state. The man who had risked his life defending American civilians overseas had been destroyed for protecting an American student. From sexual assault, the message was clear: the Garrison family's power extended beyond simple political influence into the ability to rewrite reality itself. They could transform heroes into villains, victims into aggressors, and justice into criminal behavior. They had neutralized one military veteran who threatened their system, and Tyler's text message suggested they were prepared to do it again. But as Rebecca closed her laptop and prepared for bed, she realized that Tyler had made a critical miscalculation. Mitchell had been operating within institutional constraints, trying to reform a corrupt system through official channels. He had believed that evidence and proper procedures would eventually prevail over political influence and family connections. Rebecca harbored no such illusions. 3 combat deployments had taught her that sometimes evil could only be stopped by people willing to operate outside the rules that protected it. Sometimes the only way to protect innocent people was to become something that predators feared more than their own consequences. She spent the next several days conducting reconnaissance with the methodical precision that had kept her alive in hostile territory. She studied Tyler's routines, identifying patterns in his movement and behavior that revealed vulnerabilities in his operational security. She mapped the school's layout with tactical precision, noting sight lines, choke points, and areas where confrontations could occur without witnesses. Most importantly, she began gathering intelligence on Tyler's support network and the psychological factors that motivated his behavior. She discovered that his cruelty wasn't random sadism, but calculated dominance displays designed to maintain his position in Lincoln Valley's social hierarchy. He was a predator, but he was also a politician, carefully managing his public image. While conducting his campaign of terror against vulnerable students, Rebecca's analysis revealed that Tyler's power was built on carefully constructed myths about his own invincibility and the helplessness of his victims. He had never faced real consequences for his actions because the system was designed to protect him. But systems could be disrupted by people who understood their weaknesses and were willing to exploit them. The opportunity for action came sooner than Rebecca had expected. On a Thursday afternoon in early December, she was leaving her classroom when she heard familiar voices from the supply closet at the end of the hallway. The same closet where Tyler had apparently planned to imprison her during their first confrontation. Moving closer, she recognized the voices of Emma Patterson and another girl she didn't immediately identify. Both sounded terrified, their words muffled by what appeared to be restraints or gags. Rebecca's combat instincts kicked in immediately, her body flooding with the familiar cocktail of adrenaline and focused calm that preceded engagement with hostile forces. She approached the closet door with tactical silence, placing her ear against the metal surface to gather intelligence about the situation inside. 2 female voices, definitely restrained, pleading for release. Male voices responded with the kind of casual cruelty that Rebecca recognized from her encounters with enemy combatants who enjoyed inflicting suffering on helpless civilians. "Please," Emma's voice was saying, muffled but audible through the door. "We didn't do anything wrong. Just let us go." "That's where you're wrong," Tyler's voice responded, filled with the satisfied authority of someone completely in control. "You did do something wrong. You existed in my school without permission. You thought you could just ignore the natural order because some washed-up soldier made you feel brave." Rebecca felt her pulse steady into the rhythm that preceded combat. Operations. Tyler had escalated beyond psychological harassment into actual imprisonment and assault. He had crossed the line from bullying into criminal behavior, and he had done it in a way that demonstrated his complete confidence in his immunity from consequences. But Tyler had made a fatal error in his tactical planning. He had chosen to conduct his operation in an isolated area during after-school hours, believing that the lack of witnesses would protect him from accountability. Instead, he had created the perfect conditions for someone with Rebecca's training to operate without institutional constraints. She tested the closet door carefully, confirming that it was locked from the outside. The mechanism was a simple sliding bolt designed to prevent accidental closure rather than deliberate imprisonment. Tyler was apparently relying on the psychological effect of confinement rather than sophisticated security measures. Rebecca could hear at least 3 male voices inside the closet, suggesting that Tyler had brought Jake and Marcus as backup for whatever he was planning. The tactical situation was challenging but manageable. 3 opponents in a confined space with limited escape routes and no ability to call for assistance. She moved back down the hallway to her classroom and retrieved her phone, setting it to record audio and video evidence of whatever was about to transpire. Military experience had taught her the importance of documentation when conducting operations that might later require justification to higher authorities. Returning to the supply closet, Rebecca positioned herself to the side of the door where she would be invisible to anyone emerging from inside. She knocked firmly on the metal surface, using the kind of authoritative pattern that suggested official intervention. "Maintenance," she announced in a slightly deeper voice than her normal speaking tone. "We've had reports of electrical problems in this area. Everyone needs to evacuate immediately." The voices inside the closet went silent for several seconds. Then Tyler's voice, attempting to sound calm but edged with panic. "We're just getting some supplies for a class project. Give us a minute to finish up." Rebecca knocked again, more insistently. "Electrical emergencies don't wait for class projects. Open this door immediately, or I'll call security." She heard rapid whispered conversation inside the closet, then the sound of the bolt being withdrawn. Tyler emerged first, blinking in the fluorescent light of the hallway, followed by Jake and Marcus. All 3 were clearly agitated, their movements quick and nervous. Behind them, Rebecca could see Emma Patterson and Jennifer Walsh, a sophomore she recognized from her 3rd period class. Both girls were sitting on the floor with their hands zipped tied behind their backs and duct tape across their mouths. Their eyes were wide with terror and relief at the prospect of rescue. Tyler turned to look for the maintenance worker who had demanded their evacuation, his expression shifting from relief to shock when he saw Rebecca standing calmly beside the door. For a moment, neither of them moved, the hallway filled with the kind of electric tension that preceded violence. "Miss Stone," Tyler said finally, his voice carefully controlled despite the obvious panic in his eyes. "What a surprise to see you here." Rebecca stepped closer to the closet door, her movement casual but deliberate. "Indeed. What an interesting class project you're working on. Mr. Garrison, would you mind explaining the educational value of restraining your classmates?" Jake started to step between Rebecca and the closet, but she fixed him with the kind of stare that had frozen enemy combatants in their tracks. He stopped mid-movement, suddenly uncertain about his role in whatever confrontation was developing. "There's been a misunderstanding," Tyler said, falling back on his usual deflection tactics. "We were just playing a game. Everyone was having fun until you showed up." Rebecca looked past him at Emma and Jennifer, both still bound and gagged, their faces streaked with tears. "They look like they're having a wonderful time. Perhaps you could remove their restraints so they can tell me about this game themselves." The request hung in the air like a challenge that everyone present understood was really an ultimatum. Tyler could comply and lose control of the situation, or he could refuse and confirm that his actions were criminal rather than consensual. "I think "There's been enough interference for one day," Tyler said, his mask of politeness finally slipping completely. "This doesn't concern you, Miss Stone. Walk away." Rebecca smiled with the kind of calm certainty that made all three boys take an involuntary step backward. "I'm afraid it became my concern the moment you decided to imprison students in my hallway. Now we can resolve this situation easily, or we can resolve it in a way that you'll find considerably less pleasant." The confrontation was about to escalate beyond words, and everyone present understood that whatever happened next would fundamentally change the power dynamics at Lincoln Valley High School forever. Rebecca could see the exact moment when Tyler made his decision. His eyes hardened with the kind of desperate calculation that came from realizing there was no way out except through violence. He was trapped between his criminal actions and his unwillingness to face consequences, and people in that position rarely made rational choices. "Marcus, Jake," Tyler said quietly, never taking his eyes off Rebecca. "We need to handle this situation before it gets out of hand." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Tyler and the two bound girls in the closet. "Man, this is already way out of hand. Maybe you should shut up and do what I tell you," Tyler snapped, his carefully maintained leadership facade cracking under pressure. "We're already committed. The only way out is forward." Rebecca recognized the logic of escalation that had driven enemy combatants to increasingly desperate acts when their initial plans failed. Tyler was about to cross a line that would transform him from a school bully into something far more dangerous, and he was prepared to drag his friends down with him. "Mr. Garrison," Rebecca said, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that had talked armed insurgents into surrendering their weapons, "I want you to think very carefully about what you're considering. Right now, you're looking at school, disciplinary action, and possibly some community service. What you're thinking about doing will put you in adult prison." Tyler's laugh was bitter and filled with the kind of entitled rage that came from a lifetime of immunity from consequences. "You think you know how this works? You think the rules apply to people like me? Ask your friend Mitchell how that worked out for him." The reference to her predecessor confirmed what Rebecca had already suspected. Tyler knew exactly what had happened to the last teacher who had tried to protect students from the Garrison family. He was confident that his family's influence would shield him from accountability, no matter how far he escalated the situation. "Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell made the mistake of operating within the system," Rebecca replied evenly. "He believed that evidence and proper procedures would eventually prevail over political corruption. I don't share his faith in institutional justice." Something in her tone made all three boys pause. There was a quality to her voice that suggested she was no longer speaking as a teacher bound by professional constraints, but as someone preparing to operate under very different rules of engagement. Jake took a step toward Rebecca, using his size to try to intimidate her into backing down. "Look, lady, you need to mind your own business and walk away. This doesn't have to involve you." Rebecca's assessment of Jake was immediate and tactical. 6'4", approximately 230 pounds, athletic but untrained in actual combat. His movements suggested someone accustomed to using size and strength to overwhelm opponents, but he telegraphed his intentions with the kind of obvious preparation that made him vulnerable to someone with professional training. "I'm afraid it became my business when you decided to commit felonies in my workplace," Rebecca said, sidestepping Jake's advance with fluid grace that spoke of extensive hand-to-hand combat training. "Now you have a choice. Release those students immediately and face school discipline, or continue down this path and discover why the Army spent 3 years teaching me to neutralize threats to civilian populations." Tyler's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Being lectured by someone he considered beneath him was humiliating enough, but having his authority questioned in front of his followers was intolerable. He had built his reputation on being the dominant force in any confrontation, and Rebecca's calm defiance was undermining everything he had worked to establish. "You're bluffing," Tyler said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're a teacher. You can't hurt students, no matter what. Your background is. There are rules, laws, oversight. You touch any of us and your career is over." Rebecca nodded thoughtfully, as if Tyler had raised an interesting philosophical point rather than issued a threat. "You're absolutely correct about the rules governing teacher-student interactions. They're very clear and very strict. But you stopped being students the moment you committed assault and false imprisonment." She pulled out her phone and held it up so they could see the recording indicator. "According to my audio and video evidence, you are 3 adult-sized criminals who have taken hostages in a school building. The law is quite different regarding citizen intervention in felony crimes in progress." The implications of her statement hit Marcus first. His family's restaurant couldn't survive the scandal of his involvement in a kidnapping case, and his college prospects would evaporate completely if he ended up with a criminal record. He took a step back from Tyler, clearly reconsidering his loyalty to someone whose plans had escalated beyond anything he was prepared to participate in. "Tyler, this is insane," Marcus said, his voice shaking with genuine fear. "Let's just untie them and leave. We can figure out the rest later." But Tyler was beyond rational thought now, driven by the kind of desperate fury that made cornered animals dangerous. He had spent his entire life believing that his family's power made him untouchable, and Rebecca's challenge to that belief was threatening the foundation of his entire worldview. "Nobody's leaving until she understands her place," Tyler snarled, abandoning all pretense of civilized behavior. "We're going to teach her the same lesson we were teaching those two." He gestured toward Emma and Jennifer, still bound and terrified. In the supply closet, Rebecca felt the familiar shift in her consciousness that preceded combat operations. The careful professional mask she had maintained for months fell away, replaced by the focused lethality that had kept her alive through 3 deployments in hostile territory. The shy teacher who had tried to avoid confrontation was gone, replaced by Staff Sergeant Rebecca Stone, combat veteran and expert in close-quarters battle. "Last chance," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Release the hostages and surrender, or discover why insurgents in Afghanistan learned to fear American soldiers." Tyler's response was to lunge directly at her, his movements driven more by rage than strategy. Rebecca sidestepped his attack with minimal effort, using his momentum against him to send him crashing into the bank of lockers with enough force to dent the metal doors. The sound echoed through the empty hallway like a gunshot. Jake tried to grab her from behind while she was supposedly distracted by Tyler's attack, but Rebecca had been tracking his movement through peripheral vision and muscle memory. She ducked under his reaching arms and drove her elbow into his solar plexus with surgical precision, dropping him to his knees gasping for breath. Marcus made a desperate attempt to reach the main hallway and escape the situation entirely, but Rebecca intercepted him with a movement so fast it seemed to violate the laws of physics. Her hand settled on his shoulder with exactly the right amount of pressure to immobilize him without causing permanent damage. "I don't want to hurt you, Marcus," she said, her voice returning to the gentle tone she used with struggling students. "But I can't let you leave to call for backup or destroy evidence. Sit down against the wall and stay quiet until this is over." Marcus nodded frantically and slumped against the lockers, clearly grateful to be removed from active participation in whatever was about to happen between Rebecca and Tyler's group. Tyler struggled to his feet, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead where he had struck the locker door. His perfect hair was disheveled and his expensive shirt was torn, destroying the carefully cultivated image of untouchable superiority he had maintained for years. "You're going to pay for this," he gasped, wiping blood from his face with the back of his hand. "My father will have you arrested. You'll never work anywhere again. We'll destroy you just like we destroyed Mitchell." Rebecca's smile was gentle and genuinely sympathetic. "I understand why you think that's true. Your family has protected you from consequences for so long that you've forgotten they exist. But Tyler, you're not in Lincoln Valley anymore. You're in my world now, and the rules here are very different. She moved closer to him with the predatory grace of someone completely comfortable with violence. In my world, people who hurt children don't get protected by political connections. They get neutralized by professionals who take their jobs seriously. Tyler tried to back away but found himself trapped between Rebecca and the damaged lockers. For the first time in his life, he was experiencing genuine fear, not social embarrassment or minor consequences, but the primitive terror of prey, realizing it was being hunted by an apex predator. "Jake," Tyler called desperately to his friend, who was still on his knees struggling to breathe normally. "Help me out here." Jake looked up at Rebecca with the kind of respectful fear that suggested he understood exactly how outmatched they were. "Tyler, man, I think we should just do what she says. This lady is not messing around." Rebecca nodded approvingly at Jake's assessment. "Your friend has good survival instincts. I suggest you listen to him." She pulled out a tactical knife from her jacket pocket, a military-grade blade that she carried for utility purposes but that looked distinctly threatening in the fluorescent lighting of the school hallway. Tyler's eyes went wide at the sight of the weapon, his imagination filling in scenarios that were far worse than anything Rebecca actually intended. "I'm not going to hurt you with this," she said conversationally, noting his reaction to the knife. "I'm going to use it to cut the zip ties off those girls you've been terrorizing. But I want you to think about how easy it would be for me to use it for other purposes if you decide to cause any more problems." She moved past Tyler toward the supply closet, keeping the three boys in her peripheral vision while she knelt beside Emma and Jennifer. The zip ties were professional grade, the kind used by law enforcement for restraining suspects. Tyler had clearly planned this assault with considerable forethought. "It's okay," Rebecca said softly to the two girls as she carefully cut through their restraints. "You're safe now. These three aren't going to hurt anyone else tonight." Emma pulled the duct tape from her mouth with shaking hands. "Miss Stone, thank God you found us. They said they were going to leave us here all weekend. They said nobody would look for us until Monday." Jennifer was sobbing with relief and residual terror. "They made us call our parents and lie about staying at each other's houses. Nobody knows where we are." Rebecca felt a cold rage settle in her stomach at the revelation of how thoroughly Tyler had planned his crime. This wasn't a spontaneous act of bullying that had gotten out of hand. It was a premeditated kidnapping designed to terrorize two vulnerable students while ensuring that their disappearance wouldn't be discovered for days. "Can you walk?" Rebecca asked the girls, helping them to their feet and checking for injuries beyond the obvious restraint marks on their wrists and the psychological trauma of their ordeal. Both girls nodded, though Jennifer was still shaking badly enough that Emma had to support her weight. "We're okay," Emma said. "Scared, but okay." Rebecca turned back to Tyler and his crew, her expression harder than they had ever seen it. The gentle teacher who had tried to reason with them was completely gone, replaced by someone who radiated the kind of controlled lethality that made professional soldiers nervous. "Here's what's going to happen," she said, her voice carrying absolute authority. "Marcus, you're going to escort Emma and Jennifer to the main office. You're going to stay with them until the police arrive. You're going to give a complete and truthful statement about everything that happened here tonight." Marcus nodded eagerly, clearly grateful for any role that involved cooperation rather than continued resistance. He moved carefully toward the two girls, offering his support to Jennifer and positioning himself as their protector rather than their captor. "Jake," Rebecca continued, "you're going to sit against that wall and think very carefully about the choices that brought you to this moment. When the police arrive, you're going to tell them exactly what Tyler planned and how you participated. Complete honesty might keep you out of adult prison." Jake slumped against the lockers without argument, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. The reality of potential criminal charges had penetrated his shock, and he was beginning to understand that his association with Tyler had put his entire future at risk. "And Tyler," Rebecca said, turning her full attention to the young man who had terrorized Lincoln Valley High School for years, "you and I are going to have a conversation about consequences and accountability. The kind of conversation your family should have had with you years ago." Tyler tried to summon his usual arrogance, but his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "You can't do this. There are laws. You're supposed to be a teacher." Rebecca's smile was cold and utterly without mercy. "I was a teacher, Tyler, but you decided to turn my school into a battlefield. Now you get to learn what happens when teachers stop teaching and soldiers start soldiering." The transformation was complete. The shy educator who had tried to avoid conflict was gone, replaced by someone who understood that some lessons could only be taught through fear, and some students would only learn when they finally encountered consequences that their family's money couldn't buy their way out of. The real education was about to begin. Rebecca watched Marcus carefully escort Emma and Jennifer down the hallway toward the main office, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. The immediate threat to the victims was neutralized, but her mission was far from complete. Tyler remained a dangerous variable, and she could see in his eyes that he was already calculating ways to spin the situation to his advantage. "You know what your problem is, Tyler?" Rebecca said, settling into a comfortable stance that kept both remaining boys in her sightlines. "You've never actually faced a real opponent. Everyone you've terrorized has been smaller, younger, or more vulnerable than you. You've spent 4 years fighting children." Tyler pressed himself against the lockers, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. Blood from his forehead wound had dried on his face, giving him the appearance of someone who had already lost a battle he thought he couldn't lose. "This isn't legal," he stammered, grasping for the protection that rules and procedures had always provided his family. "You assaulted students. You threatened us with a weapon. I don't care what your background is. Teachers can't do this." Rebecca pulled out her phone and showed him the recording that was still running. "Actually, I defended myself against 3 individuals who were committing aggravated kidnapping. The law is quite clear about citizen intervention in felony crimes. But more importantly, Tyler, you're not thinking strategically." She moved closer, close enough that he could see the absolute certainty in her eyes. "You're still operating under the assumption that your family's political connections will protect you from consequences. But you've crossed a line that even their influence can't erase." The sound of approaching sirens in the distance confirmed what Rebecca had already set in motion. While Tyler had been focused on his immediate predicament, she had been executing a broader tactical plan that would eliminate his ability to escape accountability through political maneuvering. "Emma and Jennifer are giving their statements to police officers right now," Rebecca continued conversationally, "complete with details about how you planned this kidnapping, how you made them lie to their parents, how you intended to leave them imprisoned for an entire weekend." Tyler's face went white as the implications hit him. "They'll say whatever you told them to say, their word against mine. My family has lawyers who will tear apart any testimony from traumatized teenagers." Rebecca's laugh was genuinely amused. "You're still not thinking clearly. This isn't a he said she said situation. I have everything on video. Your confession, your threats, your assault on those girls. But more importantly, I have something your family has never had to deal with before." She held up her phone, showing him not just a recording app, but a live stream indicator that had been running since before the confrontation began. "I've been broadcasting everything to a private military network that includes about 40 of my former unit members. Combat veterans who take a very dim view of Americans who prey on children." The blood drained from Tyler's face as he realized the scope of what he was facing. His family's influence extended throughout Lincoln Valley and parts of Montana. But It meant nothing to a network of professional soldiers who operated by very different codes of conduct. Some of those veterans work in federal law enforcement now, Rebecca continued. Others work in media, legal advocacy, and child protection services. By tomorrow morning, your case will be in the hands of people who can't be bought, threatened, or politically influenced. Jake, still sitting against the wall, found his voice for the first time since the physical confrontation. Tyler, man, we need to call our parents. We need lawyers. This is way bigger than anything we can handle ourselves. But Tyler was beyond rational thought, driven by the kind of desperate panic that came from watching his entire world collapse in real time. His family's power had always been his shield against consequences, and the revelation that he was now facing forces beyond. Their influence had shattered his fundamental understanding of how the world worked. "You can't do this to me," he whispered, his voice cracking with genuine fear. "Do you know who my father is? Do you understand what my family means to this community?" Rebecca's expression softened with something that might have been sympathy. "I understand exactly what your family means to this community, Tyler. They're the reason Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell was destroyed for protecting a student from sexual assault. They're the reason dozens of vulnerable kids have suffered in silence rather than report your behavior. They're the reason Lincoln Valley High School became a hunting ground for predators." She knelt down so she was at eye level with the terrified teenager. "But here's what you don't understand. Your family's local power is meaningless against federal jurisdiction. Kidnapping across state lines, conspiracy to commit assault, using electronic communications to threaten victims. These are federal crimes. Tyler, they're handled by people who don't care about your father's position on the school board." The sirens were getting closer, and Rebecca could hear multiple units responding. She had been very specific in her call to emergency services, using terminology that would ensure federal agencies were notified alongside local law enforcement. "The FBI has specific task forces that handle cases involving systematic abuse of minors," she continued, her voice taking on the instructional tone she used in difficult classroom lessons. "They're particularly interested in situations where local political corruption has prevented proper investigation and prosecution of crimes against children." Tyler tried to speak but found his voice had abandoned him entirely. The confidence that had carried him through years of terrorizing classmates had evaporated in the face of consequences that his family's money and influence couldn't eliminate. "The beautiful thing about federal jurisdiction," Rebecca said, standing and checking her phone as emergency vehicles pulled into the school parking lot, "is that it's completely immune to small-town politics. Your father can sit on every school board in Montana, and it won't matter to federal prosecutors who see child predators the same way regardless of their family connections." Detective Sarah Morrison was the first officer to reach their location, responding to the emergency call with the kind of professional urgency that suggested she understood the serious nature of the situation. Rebecca recognized her immediately. Sarah was a veteran herself, Army military police who had transitioned to civilian law enforcement after her service. "Ma'am," Detective Morrison said, her voice carrying the respectful tone that veterans used with each other, "I'm going to need you to step away from the subjects while we sort this situation out." Rebecca complied immediately, moving to a position where she could observe, but not interfere with the official investigation. Her phone continued recording everything, documenting the professional response that would make it impossible for anyone to claim the situation had been mishandled. "Detective Morrison," Rebecca said formally, "I'm Rebecca Stone, faculty member at this school. I intervened in an in-progress kidnapping involving 3 adult perpetrators and 2 minor victims. The victims have been evacuated to safety and are providing statements to your colleagues." Detective Morrison's assessment of the scene was rapid and professional. Tyler slumped against the lockers with obvious injuries. Jake sitting nearby in a state of shock. Evidence of restraints and assault scattered around the supply closet. and Rebecca standing calmly with the bearing of someone comfortable with law enforcement procedures. "Mr. Garrison," Detective Morrison said, addressing Tyler with the kind of neutral professionalism that offered no hint of special treatment, "you're under arrest for aggravated kidnapping, conspiracy to commit assault, and unlawful imprisonment. You have the right to remain silent." As the Miranda warning continued, Tyler seemed to shrink into himself, the reality of his situation finally penetrating his shock. He was no longer Tyler Garrison, untouchable scion of Lincoln Valley's most powerful family. He was suspect number one in a federal kidnapping case, and all the political influence in Montana couldn't change that fact. Jake accepted his arrest with the resigned cooperation of someone who understood that resistance would only make his situation worse. He had been a follower in Tyler's schemes, and his cooperation with law enforcement might be the only thing that prevented him from facing the same level of charges as his former friend Dot. As the two boys were led away in handcuffs, Tyler made one final attempt to reassert the privilege that had protected him his entire life. "This is a mistake," he called back to Rebecca, his voice echoing in the empty hallway. "My family will fix this. You'll be sorry you ever crossed us." Rebecca's response was calm and final. "Your family can't fix federal charges, Tyler. And the only thing I'm sorry about is that it took this long for someone to hold you accountable for your actions." The transformation was complete. Lincoln Valley High School's reign of terror had ended not through administrative intervention or parental discipline, but through the decisive action of someone who understood that some lessons could only be taught through consequences that money and influence couldn't buy. 3 weeks after Tyler Garrison's arrest, Lincoln Valley High School was a fundamentally different place. The transformation hadn't happened gradually, it had been immediate and dramatic, like the sudden silence that follows the end of a thunderstorm. Emma Patterson walked through the cafeteria with her head held high for the first time in years, carrying her lunch tray to a table near the windows where she was joined by Jennifer Walsh and several other students who had previously eaten in isolated corners to avoid Tyler's attention. Their conversation was animated and relaxed, the kind of normal teenage interaction that had been impossible under the previous regime of fear. David Kim had returned from his advanced mathematics program at the local community college, where he'd been transferred for his own safety after Tyler's initial harassment. His confidence had grown remarkably during his brief absence, and he now tutored other students in calculus and physics, finding purpose in helping his peers succeed academically. The most visible change was in the hallways themselves. Students moved with a different energy, less hurried, less fearful, more willing to make eye contact and engage in casual conversation. The invisible boundaries that had once segregated the school's social hierarchy had dissolved, replaced by more natural groupings based on shared interests rather than enforced dominance. Rebecca stood at her classroom window during lunch period, observing these changes with the quiet satisfaction of a mission accomplished. Her own transformation was complete as well. The wire-rimmed glasses and conservative cardigans remained, but her posture and bearing now reflected someone comfortable with her own authority. Students approached her with respect rather than dismissive indifference, understanding instinctively that she was someone who could be trusted to protect them. Principal Williams knocked on her classroom door, entering with the kind of respectful demeanor she had never shown Rebecca before. The incident, the political calculations that had once governed their relationship, had been rendered irrelevant by federal intervention and media attention that extended far beyond Lincoln Valley's borders. "Rebecca," Williams said, settling into a student desk with uncharacteristic humility, "I wanted to update you on the legal proceedings and discuss some changes we're implementing for next semester." Rebecca turned from the window, giving her administrator the kind of polite attention she had always shown, but which now carried undertones of someone who had demonstrated her ability to operate outside institutional constraints when necessary. Tyler's federal charges are proceeding as expected, Williams continued. His family's attorneys have been unable to negotiate any kind of plea deal that would avoid prison time. The FBI's investigation has uncovered evidence of systematic harassment going back to his freshman year, and they're treating this as a pattern of escalating criminal behavior rather than an isolated incident. The update confirmed what Rebecca had expected. Once federal agencies became involved, the political protection that had shielded the Garrison family for generations became not just ineffective, but counterproductive. Their attempts to influence the investigation had only drawn more scrutiny to their previous interventions in local law enforcement matters. "What about Jake and Marcus?" Rebecca asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer based on their behavior during the crisis. Jake's cooperation with investigators has earned him a significantly reduced sentence, probably community service and supervised probation. Marcus's testimony has been particularly valuable, and the prosecutor is recommending that charges against him be dropped entirely in exchange for his continued cooperation. Rebecca nodded approvingly. Both boys had made poor choices in following Tyler's leadership, but they had also demonstrated capacity for moral growth when confronted with real consequences. Marcus, in particular, had shown genuine remorse and had become an advocate for the victims rather than trying to minimize his own role. "The school board has asked me to discuss our anti-bullying policies with you," Williams continued, her tone suggesting that this was more consultation than administrative directive. "Given your unique qualifications, they're hoping you might help us develop more effective intervention strategies." The request was a tacit admission that traditional educational approaches had failed to address the systematic abuse that had flourished under Tyler's reign. Williams was essentially asking Rebecca to formalize the methods that had proven successful in neutralizing the threat when official channels had been inadequate. "I'd be happy to contribute to policy development," Rebecca replied diplomatically. "Though I think the most effective interventions involve creating environments where potential predators understand that their actions will have immediate and unavoidable consequences." Williams shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that Rebecca was describing approaches that went beyond traditional disciplinary measures. "The board is also concerned about liability issues and proper procedures." "Of course," Rebecca said with a slight smile. "I'm sure the board's legal counsel can help them understand the difference between institutional liability and individual citizen responses to crimes in progress." The distinction was crucial and deliberate. Rebecca had acted not as a school employee bound by educational policies, but as a trained civilian intervening in a federal crime. The legal precedent was clear and well established, particularly for military veterans with specific training in protecting civilian populations. Soft knock on the classroom door interrupted their conversation. Emma Patterson stood in the doorway, holding a manila envelope and wearing the kind of nervous expression that suggested she had something important to communicate. "Miss Stone," Emma said quietly, "could I speak with you for a moment? It's about the situation with Tyler and what happened before." Rebecca gestured for her to enter, noting that Emma's posture and demeanor reflected someone who had reclaimed her sense of personal agency. The terrified victim who had been bound and gagged in the supply closet had been replaced by a young woman who understood her own worth and rights. "I wanted to give you this," Emma said, handing Rebecca the envelope. "It's letters from students who were too scared to speak up before, about things Tyler and his friends did to them over the years. Things that never got reported because everyone knew nothing would happen." Rebecca accepted the envelope with the solemnity of someone receiving classified intelligence. The weight of the papers inside suggested a substantial documentation of systematic abuse that had been hidden by fear and institutional indifference. "The FBI agent said these statements might help with the federal case," Emma continued. "But we also wanted you to know what you did. It didn't just save Jennifer and me. It saved everyone who was going to be Tyler's next target. Williams looked uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, clearly recognizing that the contents of the envelope would reveal the extent to which the school's administration had failed to protect vulnerable students. Her discomfort was irrelevant to Rebecca, who understood that accountability sometimes required exposing uncomfortable truths. "Thank you, Emma," Rebecca said sincerely. "Your courage in coming forward has made it possible for other victims to find their voices as well." Emma smiled with the kind of genuine happiness that had been impossible under Tyler's regime of terror. "Miss Stone, everyone knows you used to be in the military. Some of the kids have been wondering, would you maybe start a self-defense club? Not just physical training, but like how to recognize dangerous situations and how to respond appropriately." The request was both logical and inevitable. Students who had lived under systematic intimidation wanted to learn how to protect themselves and others from future predators. They understood instinctively that Rebecca possessed skills and knowledge that could help them reclaim their sense of safety and agency. "I think that's an excellent idea," Rebecca replied, glancing at Williams to gauge her reaction. "With appropriate administrative approval, of course." Williams nodded quickly, understanding that refusing such a request would be both politically unwise and practically counterproductive. The school board was desperate to demonstrate their commitment to student safety, and Rebecca's involvement would provide credibility that traditional programs lacked. As Emma left to return to her lunch period, Rebecca stood once again at her classroom window, observing the transformed social dynamics of Lincoln Valley High School. Students moved through the corridors with purpose and confidence, engaging in conversations and activities that would have been impossible under Tyler's rule of fear. The shy teacher who had arrived in Lincoln Valley hoping to avoid conflict was gone, replaced by someone who understood that peace could only be maintained by people willing to confront those who threatened it. She had not sought this role, but she had accepted it when circumstances demanded action that only her specific skills and experience could provide. Tyler Garrison would spend his 18th birthday in federal custody, awaiting trial on charges that would likely result in significant prison time. His reign of terror had ended not through gradual reform or administrative intervention, but through the decisive action of someone who understood that some predators could only be stopped by people willing to become something they feared more than their own consequences. Rebecca Stone had found her true calling, not just as an educator, but as a guardian. And Lincoln Valley High School had learned that sometimes the most important lessons were taught not in classrooms, but in moments when ordinary people chose to do extraordinary things to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload. From us,